This summer in Japan has been brutal. Japanese summers are typically brutal, but this year has been truly next level. So, what better way to spend this summer than by going to an even hotter place? Through Doom! So I got this idea a couple months ago to play through all of the official expansions included in Doom and Doom 2 and ranking them from worst to best. How I'll be ranking them is going to be pretty simple. I have 3 parameters that I will rank them out of 10 for, with a perfect score being 30 out of 30. These parameters are enjoyability, the quality of the difficulty, not its level of difficulty, and its overall consistency. It's highly subjective, and by no means am I going to say that these are at all objective, because they aren't. These are just informal scores based on my own experience to make ranking them easier for me. If you want to share what your thoughts are, feel free to comment below. I'm very interested in hearing what other people think about these. I played through all of these in canon order and on the ultra violence difficulty. I chose ultra violence because I like taking out large hordes of enemies. I will also note that since the original Doom had its 3 episodes released separately, I will treat each episode of that as their own entity, but for Legacy of Rust, I will treat its 2 episodes like one whole. So, without further ado, let's get started. Misery. Thy name is Legacy of Rust. The first official expansion to Doom 2 in forever, and unfortunately, it takes the bottom spot in this ranking. What honestly starts out as pretty promising quickly devolves into a slog. Maps become increasingly esoteric in design and overstay their welcome in a lot of cases. Navigating some of these levels almost feels like you're accomplishing nothing, and there are so many false endings at exits, it makes one wonder if this is meant to be more of a satire than an actual Doom 2 expansion. It isn't terrible, since there are some really enjoyable moments. The new enemies are welcome, and the flamethrower is extremely satisfying to use. But unfortunately, Legacy of Rust ends up employing some of the worst elements of Thy Flesh Consumed, and at some points leverages the extreme resource scarcity present in the opening map of Sigil II, that, when combined with the seemingly unreasonable number and quality of enemies a la, once again, Thy Flesh Consumed, it just devolves into a save-scumming nightmare. This isn't what I would consider a good kind of difficulty. This is the kind of difficulty that seems legitimately unfair, and its enjoyability suffers immensely because of it. Unbalanced and at times too ambitious for its own sake. It's more content, I guess, but if it's going to insult me with its BS, then I have no reservations about running through it in its entirety with cheats, and with the utmost contempt for it. I really like Doom 2. So when I saw that the master levels for Doom 2 were included in the Doom plus Doom 2 remaster, I was pretty excited to see what this had to offer. Unfortunately, I found it to be a bit of a downgrade, quite a bit of a downgrade. The first half of this expansion is pretty enjoyable, if a little lacking in memorability, but the second half sees a pretty sharp spike in, once again, esoteric level design, be it invisible pathways required to be traveled across to get keys crucial to progression, to opening unmarked walls with important switches behind them that can only be opened if you have the relevant key, to the sometimes overly convoluted exits to levels and the obsession the designers had with revenants near the end. It's not really the best designed set of levels, one of which took me nearly an hour to finish. When I finally got to the end of the game and defeated the final boss, which itself was kind of a reprisal of the Icon of Sin fight, albeit mercifully simplified, I wish I could have had a better time with this one, though it did have its moments, like when I could crush the Cyber Demon, for example. Some of these levels are pretty creative and do a lot to create some of the most believable environments in any of these classic Doom episodes thus far. It's just too bad I couldn't seem to have quite the good time with this one as I did with some of the other expansions. 20 levels is pretty substantial, however, so at least it's a lot of content for what it's worth. The infamous fourth episode, which was originally created specifically for Doom's retail release as a bonus. This episode is billed as the episode to put the skills of the most die-hard Doom fans to the test. These days, it is understood as the weakest episode from the Ultimate Doom for its difficulty. I personally have attempted this episode a number of times, first on the OG Xbox as part of the Resurrection of Evil expansion, and then again on PC. Both times I couldn't get past the first mission despite countless tries. I was a little apprehensive getting to this episode, but also confident since my skill at games in general has improved a lot since the last time I attempted it. After finishing this episode on Ultraviolence, I have mixed feelings. On the one hand, a number of episodes weren't really that bad, but the most difficult episodes were the ones which seemed designed with only one means of progression that was really practical. These stages were difficult only because of this, and in contrast to a number of the other levels where the stage progression was more open-ended, the difficulty in the more railroaded stages feels a bit artificial. These stages also tend to spawn numerous enemies with elevated platforms with highly limited floor space, making it difficult not to take damage. John Romero's levels. With practice, I assume that these levels would probably fall like a house of cards, but I can't imagine that they would get any more enjoyable. These stages hurt the enjoyability for me, at least, and I found myself more enjoying the stages which have a more free-flowing exploration-driven design with arenas full of enemies usually completely surrounding you. Being a fan of Doom the Dark Ages, seeing these kinds of enemy counts in classic Doom is really fun and exciting. As the episode gave way to the level designs more typical of Doom's base design, once I finally bested the spider mastermind, the game ended. The way it ended, it so suddenly took me by surprise, as I felt the episode was just getting up to speed. At least it let off on a high note. I'm surprised at the mixed feelings I have. On the one hand, the difficulty is fair, but when it isn't, it's insultingly so, and usually related to the level design and layout itself. Combat is great, and every combat encounter and the Baron of Hell enemy count was really fun. I liked this episode more than I thought I would, but I can still understand why it is disliked. Its first impression isn't very strong, but it gets better if a little easier as you progress, which kind of feels counterintuitive. The first episode for the final Doom expansion for Doom 2, TNT Evilution, was one that I was looking forward to experiencing. The first impression I had of this expansion was pretty good, but since this episode is 30 levels long, not every level was one that left the best impression. Some of it kind of blends together, I think probably thanks to the mostly homogeneous level theming. Each map's difficulty has variations from one to the next, and because of that, there is a decent balance between them, but at the same time I felt that the peaks and valleys in the episode between the levels does lead to a roller coaster-esque feeling. That being said, there isn't anything in this episode that relies on super obtuse level design. There are invisible walls still, but enemy placement, while tricky in some places, is totally fair, and there really is no challenge I could call insurmountable. Mount Pain almost gets there with its lack of healing and its literal hordes of enemies and gauntlet of surprise ambushes, but TNT Evilution can be defeated through the power of persistence. I believe this episode is at its best when it's throwing its hordes of enemies at you from all directions. It keeps you on your toes and forces you to pay attention to the enemy audio cues in order to manage how to take them out in the most effective way to minimize the damage you take from them. I think the reason this episode is ultimately so low on this list is because I felt that it went on a bit too long. I didn't really feel that way about some of the other ones, and despite its length, it was still more fun than the previous episodes or expansions I've discussed, which are much shorter, but 30 levels felt a bit much for this, and I felt that there was a lot of extra fat that could have used trimming. But that's just me, and it's probably thanks again to the mostly samey look of the levels until the very end. The final boss is also not the most memorable thing. It's a mostly simplified version of the Icon of Sin, with the only problem I encountered being the endless spawning of enemies in the lower part of the screen, taking up most of the rockets I attempted to fire into the Baphomet's brain cavity. I think the main thing I will take away from this episode, more than anything else, is Revenant spam, and the higher than average population of Archviles scattered across the different maps. I didn't mind the Archviles, but the Revenants got a little tiring after a while. This expansion for Doom 2 was released by Nerve Software long after the original release of Doom 2 as part of their remaster of the original two games back in 2010. This was the first officially released expansion since TNT and Plutonia, and this one was pretty decent. It was pretty enjoyable, with the only issue being that some of the levels were pretty simple to get through, and so they weren't really as memorable. I try to go into these with as little background knowledge as possible so that I can get the purest impression of them, but I had inadvertently come across information about this expansion upon initially figuring out what order I should play these expansions in. Apparently, this expansion was intended to be built for those who were series veterans who needed more challenge, and upon the first few levels I began to wonder if this was really so difficult or if it was 2010 difficult. It was around this time when it seemed that people were really complaining about how easy games were at the time. So what counted as difficult in this era might not actually be that bad. While the first few levels of this expansion are pretty simple, all things considered, the last couple maps do offer up some challenge, especially as it pertains to enemy types in combination to their spawn points. But even then, if you're used to expansions like Die Flesh Consumed, Master Levels Sigil or Sigil II, or Plutonia or whatever, there really is nothing about No Rest for the Living that seems quite insurmountable. Even the final boss stage, which probably has the highest concentration of imps in the entire series. All that being said, in the grand scheme of things, this expansion, which is a pretty short 8 levels, 9 if you reach the secret level, is a pretty consistent breeze to get through, save for the difficulty spike near the very end. Even if it's mostly forgettable as an expansion, I do think it's still pretty good and worth playing through. Though, I might recommend Ultraviolence or higher difficulty to get the most challenge out of this one as possible. Teleporting from the Deimos base to the Phobos base, Shores of Hell is already a step up in difficulty from knee-deep in the dead. The chief points of difficulty in this episode lies in the combination of map designs, enemy placement, type and density, and availability of weapons and ammo. I found myself, especially in the beginning, struggling mostly with the lack of ammo for my sparse arsenal of weapons, which don't carry over from the first episode, Knee Deep in the Dead. The chainsaw ended up being invaluable in this regard, and part of the fun of the difficulty for this episode was tricking the enemies into either attacking each other or stacking up in a neat row and chainsawing them one by one. This episode seems to require smart movement through the stages in a way that the first doesn't really seem to emphasize very much. While some maps' difficulty consistency seems a little lopsided at times, this episode still contains some of my favorite levels in classic Doom. And that's really all there is to say about that. The third and final episode in the original Doom, this is a fitting conclusion to the game. This episode's difficulty is based mostly around navigating increasingly large levels, which require you to really look around and remember the layout in order to unlock the necessary pathways to move forward. I have a lot of memories with the later stages in this episode, especially the Unholy Cathedral and Purgatory. These levels are tricky, and I've heard some people complain about them and the way they are laid out in the past. But especially with Purgatory, I remember having a lot of fun exploring the map on the SNES version and figuring out the way to the end of the stage. Level memorization might not seem exactly possible, but they do reward curiosity. If you just take time and look around, the solution to these stages can be discovered intuitively, and that's what I like about the latter half of this episode. The difficulty in the beginning is a little sketchy, I have to admit. Spawning you in with only your fists and a handgun against a number of upper tier enemies really tests your skill, especially your movement skill, which is key to getting the demons to start fighting each other so you can save your ammo resources. It seems a little unfair in the beginning, however, since the kind of enemy placement and enemy density is about on par with some of the tougher levels in the Shores of Hell. But once you get accustomed to it, you start to use your surroundings and tools at your disposal to feel your way through the rest of the earlier stages. For consistency of level difficulty, then, Inferno has a strange de-escalation of difficulty as you proceed, As you acquire more weapons and more ammo, enemy strength and density seems to decrease to a noticeable degree, and you're kind of left with contending mostly with the stage designs themselves as opposed to the enemy hazards. The last boss, the Spider Mastermind, is a total pushover since by that point you'll have procured the BFG, which can totally body the Spider Mastermind in 3 to 4 shots, or even 2 if you're really close. It's a little unbelievable how easy it gets, especially compared to the Cyber Demon, who was much tougher and posed a much greater threat with the damage output of his rocket launcher, which fires much quicker than your own. Overall, Inferno is still a good time and is my second favorite episode of the original Doom episodes released. This is the first modern expansion to classic Doom by one of its chief designers, John Romero. Sigil is a 9-mission long unofficial episode that is no less substantial than the official episodes. I had no expectations going into this one, but since it was by John Romero, and knowing what I know about his maps in Thy Flesh Consumed, I felt the Cyber Demon would probably be a recurring enemy. I wasn't disappointed. To put it simply, Sigil isn't for the faint of heart. This isn't an easy expansion and is definitely for those with deeper experience with Doom than limited to simply knee-deep in the dead at Hurt Me Plenty difficulty. Not trying to sound elitist by pointing that out, mind you, it's more of a warning. The level designs are more akin to what you might see from Thy Flesh Consumed or from Doom 2 in some cases, with very tricky enemy placement, especially later in the episode. Some of the levels and enemy placement feel a bit overambitious for the engine, specifically the penultimate stage, at least on Ultraviolence. All that being said, this is a fair episode. The difficulty scales consistently, and the difficulty level, while high, is fair. These are some of the most creative level designs in classic Doom so far, and if you like a good challenge, Sigil will definitely present you with one that can keep you busy for a long time. Here, the second episode created by John Romero for classic Doom. And this episode somehow turned out even more brutal than Thy Flesh Consumed and Sigil in terms of difficulty. Romero really wanted to test the skill of those who always insist on playing on the ultra-violence difficulty, and thus, we are immediately greeted to what is easily the hardest first map of the classic Doom lineup, at least before Doom 2 and its expansions. I feel like after finishing this on Ultraviolence, I can go back to Doom E1 M1 on Nightmare and not break a sweat. Sigil II tests everything you've ever learned about Doom. Ever. Be it shooting, resource management, and coping with scarcity, platforming, and combat movement. On Ultraviolence and higher, on top of the generous number of Cacodemons, Barons of Hell, and Lost Souls, there is also at least one Cyber Demon in every stage. Typically, there are 2 or more. That makes finding secrets and fast, decisive movement and platforming almost essential, lest you get destroyed in 1 second or less by a cyber demon's rocket. Difficulty decreases significantly on Hurt Me Plenty, but since I like my games like I like my food, just spicy enough to skirt the edge of palatability, I pushed through Ultraviolence. I found the experience just as enjoyable as its predecessor. In spite of its difficulty, the challenge presented here is just enough to make you question if it's possible to finish, yet when you change your strategy according to enemies, their placements, and the map, you can find that it is much more possible than it might seem. Sigil II is the first Doom episode where I genuinely felt that it was more beneficial to start a level with a pistol than your entire previous level loadout. Call me crazy, but this expansion is so exquisitely and tastefully designed that you will never find yourself wanting for resources, weapons, and health as long as you play smart. The difficulty is nearly flawless, and while it is hard and you will die many times trying to get it right, the payoff is extremely satisfying. Doom 2 Hell on Earth, unlike its predecessor, is not divided into episodes. Instead, all 32 maps are one continuous string. This is the first time I'm playing any part of Doom 2 on Ultraviolence difficulty. My first ever impression of Doom 2 was not extremely strong, but the various maps featured in this game did leave a lasting impression. Going back into this game, I found Doom 2 improves immensely on Ultraviolence difficulty. I really like the maps in this game. Even the ones that have been criticized, like the large areas with tall structures that you must navigate via teleportation pads to find keys, or the infamous chasm stage with its tightropes. I remember struggling with these stages back during my first couple of playthroughs, but coming into Doom 2 this time after playing through Thy Flesh Consumed and both Sigil episodes, I didn't struggle figuring out where to go in these levels at all. Enemy placement is fair, and coupling these maps with Ultraviolence's huge population of enemies makes the game a lot more enjoyable, in my opinion. This was really fun, and while some later levels are easier than some earlier ones, the difficulty scales pretty well, even if the difficulty curve is pretty shallow compared to the OG Doom episodes. The Icon of Sin fight is still just as exciting to blast through the infinitely spawning enemies with the BFG, as always. The fight is always an adrenaline rush, and silly as it may sound, it's hard to keep my hand steady for that last rocket shot into the brain of the Icon of Sin. It's so fun and so cool. Doom 2 is a lot more fun and contains a lot more memorable maps than any other Doom episode that I can think of. It's no wonder id felt confident enough about Doom 2 to release it as the first retail release in Doom's history. This is the freeware episode of Doom, originally released in 1993, and this is what most people remember about the original Doom games. It is as influential as it is iconic. Its difficulty scales in a way that is probably perfect. New weapons are consistently introduced, and with each new weapon, enemies of greater strength begin to spawn in gradually larger numbers. Enemy density in the levels increases in a very natural way, and even though this is Ultraviolence difficulty, no combat encounter ever feels unmanageable. It's no surprise that this episode has the reputation that it does. was always under the impression that the Plutonia Experiment was one of the worst Doom 2 expansions. I remember especially seeing a video ranking Final Doom as a whole as being more akin to a throwaway expansion than it was a proper expansion on Doom 2. Released the same year as Duke Nukem 3D and Quake, one of the most cited critiques of Final Doom is that it was technically outdated, as that year saw great technological leaps in graphics technology for games that were seen clearly in the Build and Quake game engines. The Plutonia Experiment is particularly singled out as being one of the hardest, if not the hardest, collection of maps in Doom's history. I was a little skeptical at first, especially after the gauntlet that was Sigil and Sigil II. Could the Plutonia Experiment still live up to this reputation? Yes, but I loved every second of it. Since Sigil and Sigil II were based on the original Doom, they don't benefit from some of the aspects of Doom 2 that introduced greater variety and balance. The Plutonia Experiment is tough, and tougher than Sigil and Sigil II. The Plutonia Experiment relies heavily on restricting movement, limiting cover, and combining different types of enemies in large numbers, as well as creating maps that are designed somewhat like puzzle boxes that require some exploration and test your observation skill. All of these elements come together to create a highly varied, seriously challenging, but satisfying gameplay experience. Every map tests different aspects of your skills at Doom to different degrees. It's hard to explain on a per-map basis what I mean by this, but what sets this apart from its companion, TNT Evilution, is that each map has varied gameplay and really doesn't feel repetitive at all. The maps are all creative and seem to be the ultimate conclusion to its companion, which seems more like a prototype in retrospect. Plutonia is so dialed in, it cannot be understated. It benefits from the addition of the super shotgun as well as the more varied cast of enemies, especially with the chain gunners, Revenant, Hell Knights, and Archviles. Revenants and Archviles are everywhere, and chain gunners can snipe you from distances farther than you can snipe them. Plutonia forces you to stay on the offensive, keep moving, explore, and keep fighting. There are few moments of respite, and while you do get those moments, they are fleeting but well earned. The ambushes are also fun. I honestly can't understand how this is so disliked by some. Yeah, it's difficult, but come on, G-Man Lives. How is this not fun? Doom is one of my all-time favorite game franchises. I was drawn to it upon my initial exposure to it, and going all the way back to when I first played Doom on the SNES and Doom 3 on the Xbox, It's great now that you can have access to what seems to be the definitive edition of the classic Doom games in their fullest glory, all in one package through this remaster. It's hard to believe that I've sunk nearly 100 hours into this game. At this point, however, I think I'm a little doomed out for the moment. Binging through all of these in such a short time, while a great experience, also has me seeing these visuals in my sleep now. I think it's time to give it a rest, don't you say? But I can see myself coming back to this in the near future to take care of these remaining achievements for full completion. If nothing else, I think that's the sign of a timeless classic.